Brought to you by Moonbeam Multimedia. This is 16 to 1, a podcast about education, teaching, and learning.
Hello there.
Hello there, buddy.
Well, hello there, buddy.
Your old time hockey.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi, how you doing?
Yeah, how are you?
Good. Okay, we're skipping the how are you. I'm fine.
I made my money today.
Yeah, you did.
And when I say I made my money, I mean I make what a teacher makes.
Mm-hmm.
So like,
you made your teacher salary today.
I made like a large Diet Coke from McDonald's today.
Good.
Yeah.
Good.
It was a day.
Yeah.
So I had texted Chelsea earlier today about something that was happening at school. And then something completely different consumed my afternoon.
Uh-huh.
And I got home after a meeting and sitting in traffic and this whole thing. And I brought up the thing from this morning and Chelsea goes, "Oh, that was today." And
Yeah.
that's how I would like to give the timeline of the day.
Today was several days long.
It was so long that Chelsea forgot that something that I just told her about was also today.
Yeah. I was like, oh, wow, that really did happen in the same day.
So,
Okay.
here we are.
Yes, here we are.
We're in that winter of Ohio, which does happen every few years, where there's no snow.
There's no snow, but there are plenty of thunderstorms. There was thunder today, all day long.
My kids were taking their midterms, and there was this huge crack, and I was like, they pooped. Somebody pooped. Because, like, you could hear them, like they were trying not to be rude, because they were in the middle of a test.
Yeah, maybe that's the same one that caused me to look at the radar, because there were some real big cracks, and I was like, oh,
Yeah,
okay.
we don't get too many thunderstorms in January in Ohio.
No.
So that was unique. What a day.
It was a very King Lear moment.
Ooh.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Well, shall we move on to what we're talking about this week?
Yeah, do you have anything else at the top of the show?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I think that's pretty much it.
Okay. I'm fine with that.
Okay.
I'm ready to move on. That's all I have.
Okay.
I have no spoons, as you say.
No spoons. We're a spoonless
I don't think
podcast.
a BYO spoon. I don't think we've actually explained the spoons reference. I feel like we've made it before on here. Or
Well,
does it get cut?
I don't know.
Oh.
It's a pretty common way of people talking about the capacity that they have for executive function, among other things.
Yeah.
It's a common shorthand.
So if you have no spoons, it means you're out.
Yeah, it means
There's nothing left to give.
It means your brain is disengaged.
The tank is empty.
There's nothing going on upstairs. Right
And
now.
the lights are probably off.
Yeah, I think
Can't
they
even run the
shut off
lights.
the electricity. Probably.
Okay, so this episode, I'm surprised we haven't done this episode. When I saw it on the list,
We've definitely talked about things adjacent
Yeah.
to it, but we're talking about special education this week, and it's a pretty broad topic, and we're going to try to cover as much as we can, but is definitely not going to be exhaustive. But we're going to give you a little bit of a primer and some of the history of how we got to where we are now.
yeah.
But yeah, we're talking about special education. So, this is also called special needs education, focused on evaluating and meeting the learning needs of exceptional learners of all sorts. It kind of focuses on strategies and practices to instruct kids who differ socially, mentally, physically, any number or combination of those from the average or norm, to an extent that they require some sort of modification of the usual school day practice. Again, this is kind of broad, but we're, when we're talking about this, we're talking about people who might have emotional, behavioral, cognitive impairments of some sort, or intellectual, or hearing, vision, speech, and other kinds of learning disabilities, like
Physical.
We'll talk about like even dyslexia can fall, that kind of thing. Dyslexia, ADHD, attention issues. That can all fall under this pretty large umbrella of what gets treated as special education in our school system.
Well, can I also say really quickly a phrase that if you're around teachers, you might hear is the phrase like typically developing. And that's a phrase that a lot of teachers use, especially just when we're trying to discern who gets what and how much of a service or whatever And it's kind of what teachers establish over time as a baseline of what their students can and can't do. Mm-hmm. And so I will probably use that phrase later, but just to kind of provide some context, that if you hear the phrase typical learning or something like that, that just kind of means that's what we assume to understand is,
yeah,
the normal rate. You know what I mean? Like all of those types of factors. So.
I will say that, and I'm sure that among disability advocates, this gets a lot of conversation, but these terms and categories are complicated and elastic and not difficult. It's difficult to pin down, I guess I would say.
Yeah. And I would typical, I think, is a pretty loaded word, which is why I wanted to at least acknowledge it. But I think what we're all trying to do at the heart of it is just kind of acknowledge a generality of what our classroom looks like.
Well, there's definitely a tension, I would say, just in the world of special education generally, because we, as educators, the goal is to treat every learner as an individual who brings unique needs to the table in your classroom. Yeah. And in a sense, this is no different from that, but also just from a kind of like legal and school system standpoint, certain people should have and do have certain accommodations just to help ease the transition into a learning environment that works best for them. Yeah. So we're going to kind of cover some of that and talk through some of the kind of legal underpinnings of at least how in the US this works in classrooms. There's a lot of bureaucracy around some of these things and reporting and paperwork of all sorts. In
a way that isn't always best for students.
Yes,
even, I would say.
I think there's oftentimes in our quest to try to serve these students, we end up kind of ham-fistedly creating more trouble than things are worth occasionally. But again, a lot of this is really necessary just to help enable an access to learning for all learners. Yeah. So anyway, I just wanted to, at the very beginning, I went and looked at Ohio State University's education programs just as an example because it's close to home for us, but this would be pretty typical for if you're a prospective teacher going into the field of special education, if you want to be an intervention specialist or something like that. I wanted to just kind of read a couple of these courses that are required for like OSU special education program, and these are pretty close to the offerings that I saw when I was doing my master's program at Teachers College, and it's probably pretty close to some of what you took and saw in some of your education background. So anyway, just a kind of selection of courses. Again, this is from OSU's special ed course offerings. You might take classes in assessment and instruction for struggling readers, classroom and behavior management for students with disabilities, delivering efficient services to enhance inclusion, introduction to child development. That's a big one because a lot of this stuff, I think, can more aggressively impact younger learners, I guess I would say. So there are definitely age brackets of these accommodations and practices, and things get difficult depending on how old the learner is. Language and communication skills for children with mild or intensive disabilities, methods of instructions for children with mild, moderate disabilities, music for special ed teachers. I thought that was interesting. That would be kind of a fun course. And then you'd also get normal stuff like philosophy of education and then understanding phonics and its role in instruction. Yeah. I just thought that was a pretty interesting course offering. You can see it's kind of broad. There's a lot to
psychology.
There's a lot of psychology.
That was my experience as well. I think by the time that I graduated and left my undergrad, I had probably almost a minor in psychology, just because my college broke it down into, I took like adolescent to young adults, they broke it down similar to this. So I think that's pretty consistent. Yeah. And then for me, just one other note about my experience, because I do not have a license for special ed. I'm not endorsed. Everyone at my undergrad university had to take a class about special ed learners and needs and things like that. And it was actually one of my favorite classes I took in college. My professor was incredible. And every single class, she had like built-in created different ways for us to experience different types of issues for like students with disabilities or things like that. So like one whole period, all she did was lecture for the hour and a half, and we all had a foam ball that she put a pencil through, and we had to hold that. And so it was supposed to be similar to someone who might have like grip or motor, like, you know what I mean, like concerns with not being able to use all their extremities.
Motor function impairment.
And then we had like glasses we had to wear that caused your eyes to not be able to focus. And take notes like that. And she played an hour and a half long video that was supposed to create a similar experience to what someone who might be like super sensitive to like hearing concerns or maybe some type of attention deficit or something like that. And she talked and lectured while we had in the background this loud like cacophony of like all of these sounds that you couldn't place. And some of it was like words and some of it was like, it was wild. And it was like really good learning. And it was just so mind boggling for me as someone who, like I said, I don't have, a license in this. So it was a great opportunity, but it stuck with me for so long just to be like, it was wild.
Yeah. When you are used to a certain level of engagement with your own learning, and then something happens where you can't participate in that same way anymore, it can be super disruptive. And I think the value of understanding that is important. And
I would never say that I knew what it was like to experience any of those things, but it made me think. It made me consider that some of my students and even my peers might be in a very different learning experience than I am. And that's something you gotta take into account as you teach. So it was good.
Yeah.
Well, you always do the history.
History?
There's no way you're going to let me do the history from Britannica. Britannica.
I found an interesting article. This is from the Britannica entry on special education, because I wanted to, again, I don't want to go way, way deep into this, but I wanted to understand.
Yes, you do.
Well, I wanted to understand. I always think it's interesting to bring context to these conversations. There are some people who are like, why would you bother to go back all the way to the beginning of history to try to understand something? But with special education in particular, we've been doing a pretty bad job until rather recently of even trying to pay attention to accommodating different kinds of learning and learners and things they bring to the table. We'll talk about this, but I think it's interesting and important to build some of that context around these conversations, because I just think that it helps frame progress appropriately and helps us understand how much farther we have to go when we realize that some of these things are really only recently have we started to treat our fellow human beings like fellow human beings in educational contexts, for example. So anyway, yes, this, again, we'll put this in the show notes, but this is from the Britannica entry on special education. And so I wanted to go back all the way to, as I usually do, even like Greece and Rome. There are some examples of caring and treating for disabled people in ancient Greece and Rome and so on, but people with any sort of difference are typically shunned. And we still shun people with differences to a great extent, but it was even worse than it is now, if you can imagine. And then during the Middle Ages, the church became the institution that was primarily tasked with caring for disabled people of all sorts. And we didn't really see the development of techniques that we now kind of understand to be special education until probably the Renaissance. So the church might have cared for these people, but it was more of a like, oh, we are just caring for you. We are, not treating people as people again, but treating them as like wards of the state. So then in the mid 1500s, a guy named Pedro Ponce de Leon succeeded in teaching deaf pupils in Spain to speak, read, and write. No serious attempt was made to educate or train persons with visual impairments until the late 18th century. There's this guy named Valentin. Oh, wow. I'm going to not pronounce this one correctly. Valentin Hoy. He is known as the father and apostle of the blind. He opened the National Institute of Blind Youth.
Oh, cool.
In Paris, and that was in 1784. He had 12 blind children as his first pupils. I actually am kind of surprised that it was that long ago that we've been dealing with instruction of the blind for that long. I would have guessed that was relatively more recent too. But anyway, attempts to educate students with intellectual disabilities originated well, I'm sure there's some debate over where it originated really, but this particular article traced it back to the efforts of Jean-Marc Gaspard Itard, a French physician and autologist. He wrote this book called The Wild Boy of Aveyron. He related his 5-year effort to train and educate a boy who had been found running wild in the woods. A student of his, Edouard Seguin, he immigrated from France to the U.S. in 1848, devised an educational method that used physical and sensory activities to develop mental processes.
Interesting.
And Seguin's work influenced Maria Montessori. We have talked about Maria Montessori. We have an entire episode dedicated to Montessori schools. She's an Italian pediatrician who became an educator and innovator of a unique method of training young, disabled, and culturally deprived children in Rome in the 1890s and early 1900s. Her approach emphasized self-education through these specially designed materials for sensory motor training. So, anyway, this stuff did not really become universal until the late 20th century. So we have not been at this for very long.
Not at all.
In the grand history of education, we have not spent a whole lot of time practicing and refining teaching methodologies to reach people who are differently abled. So with that as the backdrop,
there's much to do.
We sort of fast forward to the modern day, where here in the U.S. we are dealing with all kinds of different ways at federal, state, and local levels of dealing with some of these special needs of learners. And as we'll kind of see as we talk more about this, a lot of these conversations end up getting reduced to the funding for particular kinds of programming. This is probably very familiar to anyone who works in education. It all gets boiled down to the dollars and cents that the education system does not have to support itself. But just to kind of set this up, so we've got federal, state, local governments. They all fund K-12 education in the U.S. Constitution says the state's responsible for public ed, as we know. Annual funding levels for special education funding initiatives, they kind of vary dramatically across the country, because we've got maybe like from $4,000 to $10,000 per student without a disability, and then $10,000 to $20,000 for students who do have disabilities. And the federal government only contributes about 10% of that total budget for both groups. We talked about that in our funding episode, because I was a little bit mind boggled by how little the federal government contributes to the education system. I thought it would be a bigger slice of the pie. And the reason I thought that, well, hoped, I guess I should say, is that federal funding is not tied to the wealth concentrated in any particular locality. And that means it has the opportunity to be more fair. But our education system,
I like how you said that, has the opportunity.
Well, yeah, because it isn't in a lot of times. But in our case, we have local taxes generating the bulk of school funding. So like 40 to 50%. Again, as we talked about in our funding episode, this really heavy reliance on local property taxes, for the most part, causes huge funding differences, even within a state and obviously across states, because it just has to do with how much your particular little chunk of land, how much revenue your little chunk of land happens to bring in. It seems so archaic to talk about it this way.
How supportive they are of their local school districts.
That's also true. Episode 45, school levies and fundraising, if you want to go check that out, because it's a constant uphill battle. The education funding war, I should say. So, funding. Perhaps we should stop defunding education.
We've said this before.
It's our unofficial tagline.
This is in every episode.
It is. Perhaps, maybe, we should stop defunding education. Okay, so why don't you set us up with a little bit of information about legal frameworks behind current practices in public schools in this country? So laws and reporting requirements and all of that. Like, how do we get to the realities, the practical realities in today's classroom?
So, special ed funding comes from two sources, federally speaking. Okay, the first one is called the Every Student Succeeds Act, and you'll see it as just ESSA. And then IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Act.
Yeah.
And it's just called IDEA because that's the That's the catchy title.
There might be funding from other sources too, but that's the bulk of it for special education.
So the Every Student Succeeds Act provides categorical funding to support student achievement in low-income areas. And IDEA accounts for the bulk of the federal government's ongoing contribution to special ed. So there's a little bit of a difference there.
So like you might apply for an ESSA grant for a particular use maybe or something like that.
So IDEA, that Disabilities Education Act, requires that the U.S. Department of Ed collects data, and then they have to submit reports as part of the use of these dollars. So there's an annual report done to Congress, or an annual report to Congress done every single year. And so the department is required by Section 664D of the IDEA.
In case you want to go look it up.
And it's to submit an annual report to Congress on the progress made towards the provision of a free, appropriate public education to all children with disabilities and the provision of early intervention services to infants and toddlers with disabilities.
Yeah.
And then there's a special section, 618 of the IDEA, that requires each state to submit data about infants and toddlers who receive early intervention services, as mentioned previously. And under Part C of that, the children with disabilities who receive special education and related services under Part B of IDEA.
Yeah.
So
that's a lot of letters and stuff, but yeah.
It's going to make sense now.
Yes.
Because what this looks like in a public education is usually two things. One is called an IEP, and the other is a 504.
IEP stands for
Individualized Education Program.
It's like a quiz.
It is.
Every time
I actually put
you.
it at the top of my box because I knew it was coming. I clicked so fast to get over to my chart.
So,
okay.
IEPs and 504s, these are essentially collections of documented interactions with students. It goes in a student's permanent file. But these are things that both the state and the federal government require as a part of this, again, mandated kind of accountability and reporting. This is the paperwork, the proof being in this paperwork that you as teachers and, your administrators and intervention specialists and psychologists, school psychologists, everyone has to touch these pieces of the puzzle when it comes to kids who are receiving services under these provisions.
Right.
Yeah.
So the important thing about both an IEP and a 504 is that they're provided at no cost to families. It is part of the education that a student receives. The other biggest distinction between the two is that an IEP is written with an intervention specialist. So a teacher who has focused their career into providing special education experiences and learning needs. 504s are not written by intervention specialists. It's done by, and in my case, it's an administrator who takes care of the 504s. So that's like one of the biggest distinctions. Even their definitions are a little bit, I think it's a little gray between the two of them because a student could have one or the other, or it can have both.
I was asking a lot of questions about this because I've always we love our acronyms and our abbreviations and everything, but I've always heard about IEPs and 504s, and I've known that they both have vaguely to do with special education, but not being a classroom teacher myself, I did not really know about the nitty-gritty details of each of these. So why don't you just briefly give me the rundown of an IEP? What's an IEP?
So an IEP provides individualized special education and related services to meet a child's unique needs. It is part of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. That's where it came from, right? It's protected by that and its use. And in order to put a child or have a child with an IEP, there are some requirements that they have to fall into. So the first thing is that they have to have one or more of 13 disabilities that have been listed in IDEA.
What are those, actually? Can you just go through those?
So it can include things like autism spectrum disorder, deaf and blindness, emotional disturbances, hearing impairments, intellectual disabilities, multiple disabilities, orthopedic, other health impairments, specific learning disabilities, speech or language, traumatic brain injuries, or visual impairment, which includes blindness. So any of those things qualify a learner for an IEP.
Which is really interesting, to me at least, that we've bracketed off things that we think are like, I don't know, special enough to require a certain level of special attention from a school. I think it's weird and kind of elastic, and just from a kind of an ed psych and an educational philosophy standpoint, how do you pick and choose what a qualifying condition is in this case? Like, what if you have a learner who isn't struggling with one of those 13 enumerated conditions, but still who still happens to need maybe more intense services? And again, that's kind of what a 504 ends up standing in for, but it's still, it's just kind of interesting to me that there's like a cutoff.
Well, it's also not to say that there isn't any differentiation anyways. I mean, if a teacher is aware that a student is not where they should be, we're going to do the best we can to meet them where they are anyways.
Yeah. I really didn't mean it from the teacher perspective. I just meant for the dedicating special funding to the project of educating these kids. Because the reason you get kind of assigned into one of these or the other, a lot of it has to do with the bureaucracy and the reporting requirements and tracing the dollars back to the education funding system. So I think it's kind of interesting that
that's an interesting take.
Well, we kind of arbitrarily put borders around what qualifies for an IEP is, I guess, what I'm trying to say. So anyway, I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad collection of things to identify, but it might be, there might be some possibilities for it to be more inclusive, I guess, would be a kind of...
Oh, you think so? You think there are things that wouldn't fall under some of these other categories?
I mean, maybe. I don't know. I just know that any time you enumerate a list, you're going to leave things off the list, is all I'm saying.
I think that phrases like specific learning disability and intellectual disability really are pretty large umbrellas for a lot of things.
And I mean,
I would be tempted to say there's probably not too much that couldn't fit somewhere in here.
I was just going to say my point might be moot because you as a classroom educator would know better than me, like whether or not there are ever times when something isn't covered that you wished would be.
I think some of these are just so broad that you could probably find a home, but that doesn't mean you can't, I suppose.
Okay.
But the other part of having an IEP, on top of having one or more of those disabilities that were listed, that disability must affect the child's educational performance or their ability to learn and benefit from like a general education opportunity. And so they have to need specialized instruction to make progress. So I think that's like the other big distinction, is that there could very well be other students who have a disability of, from this list, but it does not affect them in the way that it requires a different sort of more specific learning opportunity. So.
Okay. So what's in kind of, not exactly in contrast, but what is a 504?
Well,
on the other hand,
it's not super clear. So
I had a lot of questions about 504s
because
it seemed a little vague, more vague.
And I'm going to tell you, I'm not going to have all the answers because I'm still learning about them. So 504s are also provided at no cost to families. The 504 comes from the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And that was a federal civil rights law that worked to stop discrimination against people with disabilities. So it's from Section 504, which is why they're called a 504 plan. So there are two requirements for a 504. A child has to have any disability, and they have a whole list of a wide range of different struggles in school. And the disability must interfere with the child's ability to learn. It's a little bit less intense, I think, in the definition.
Well, there isn't there isn't a predefined list of what those conditions might be, whereas there are conditions enumerated for IEPs.
So Section 504 has a broader definition of a disability than what the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act does. And Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 states that a disability must substantially limit one or more basic life activities. It can include something like learning, reading, communicating, or thinking. And so that's why a child who doesn't qualify for an IEP might still be able to get a 504 or both or just an IEP. Like there are like sections basically. And so we could have students with both.
Right.
We could have students with one or the other.
And who gets what is determined by a large collection of individuals at the school. They're teachers, school psychologists, intervention specialists. Everyone works together to build these profiles.
So a 504 is usually done by an administrator, and an IEP is the one that's done by an intervention specialist.
When you work with IEPs and 504s, do you ever provide kind of context and feedback that goes into those records and
every
changes
year.
them? Yeah. So
every year you have to. So if you have an IEP, it is handled every single year. It's revisited. The intervention specialist assigned to the student meets with the family, whoever is the raisin. I call them raisins.
What?
It's who's ever raisin you at home.
Raisin.
Yeah, that's always what I call them. Because I have kids who are raised by, not.
A raisin.
Yeah, so I call them their raisins.
I like that.
And it's just whoever's at home with them. Because I don't actually care who it is. I just, it's whoever, is at home. That's who I care, the raisin. So whoever that is for that person who has the legal authority to make educational decisions. Because that is a topic we have to be aware of.
Yeah.
They come in and meet once a year. We readdress IEP goals. We talk about if these services are needed or not.
I was even thinking today with some of the stuff that you've been dealing with, even just today and this week, how teachers often sort of double functionally, kind of as pseudo social workers in the classroom.
It feels like it.
Some of these things are hard to sort out.
Yeah, being a mandate reporter adds a nice little level that kind of muddies the water a little bit more because we're required to report things anyways. But on top of that, we have to reflect on what the kid does or doesn't do. And if they look like their peers in certain ways or meet these, So I actually talked about this in our last episode. I was filling out an ETR, which is a part of this process. And
what's that stand for?
It was last week. I don't remember ETR. Evaluation team report? That doesn't sound right. Yeah, it is. It's an evaluation team report.
Okay.
So in the last episode, I mentioned filling out an ETR, which is an evaluation team report, which is where they gather a bunch of data and information about how the student is performing. That's part of what goes into the planning of the IEP to establish, are they receiving enough services? Are they getting too much? Are we coddling them in some ways that aren't appropriate? You know what I mean? Like, the goal of an IEP is to help make sure that they're performing at the level that they should be and that we're encouraging that the best we can. Not that we're taking it all off their plate to make it too easy for them. You know what I mean? Like, the goal isn't to make them just pass and move through. The goal is to make it as accessible to them as we can.
Right. It's about increasing access to the same level that their peers might have.
Sure.
Right.
So, our goal is always, we still want them to be challenged in all of these things, but we want to do it within reason of, what they can appropriately handle. So that's part of the IEP process, is deciding, okay, well, last year this student got double time on certain assignments. Maybe this year we can do 1.5 time. And you make those changes and you try to see if the work that you're doing with them is building them up and it is supporting them in a way that makes them, I don't want to say a better learner, but you know what I mean? You want them to be making progress always, whatever that looks like. So that's part of the IEP process, is that every year, general ed teachers, which are your core teachers, like English, history, in my case, since I teach at a high school, if you're an electives teacher, if you're their music teacher or something like that, you get a say in it as well. And so IEPs provide a really well-rounded experience and a reflection of that student to help families, parents, raisins, whoever, along with school psychologist, a school social worker if necessary, guidance counselors, administrators, and intervention specialists, to make sure that the plan that we're creating for them is best.
Yeah.
I think that was everyone. I try to remember everyone who sits at the table, in order.
Yeah.
There's a lot of us in the room, but it's good because it allows for a great conversation. I love having conversation with parents in IEP meetings because I love to hear what they see from their kid too, So it's a good process, but I know my friends, one of my closest friends at school is an intervention specialist, and it's hard work. Writing IEPs is not easy. So
Yep.
I do not envy that. That's for sure.
Yep.
So on the other side of that though, is the 504 team. So the IEP, like I said, that focuses a lot more on intervention specialists, writing it, creating it, making sure it's enforced. A 504 is created by a different team. So it's usually whoever's taking care of the child, usually general special ed teachers if necessary, and then an administrator. So a lot of times 504 meetings, teachers don't attend them necessarily unless there's a reason to. But they're usually 504s are worked out between an administrator and whoever is taking care of the child, and just to make sure that, things are where they're supposed to be. So a little bit different on that front. So that's kind of the broad parts of an IEP and 504. There's tons of little, parts of it that I still don't fully understand. And that's just because the population that that I teach, I don't have a lot of identified students. But that's just based on what I teach, and that's just how it falls in my case. But generally, special education is thought of as a homogenous whole. But just like every other approach to education, all of our learners are unique, and all of our approaches to supporting them are diverse. And every single student, even if they might have a disability, you know, if their IEP reads that they have a disability that's similar to someone else's, that doesn't mean what they receive is going to look the same from me or from anyone else.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's what's helpful about IEPs is that they help provide support for teachers too, to make sure that they're doing what's best for the kid.
Right. Yeah. Part of the reason I included that note is just because the education world, especially when it comes to teacher education, tends to try to distill things down into bite-sized reproducible chunks. So that tends to result in conversations that treat, for example, all students with visual impairment. Let's treat them all the same. And that's just not how it really is in practice. Each and every one of these sort of special education cases comes with its own unique set of challenges. And I just think it's important to kind of remember that contextually, that when we're talking about like the blind experience, it's not one homogenous experience. Everybody's experience of visual impairments is different, for example. And so even though we're kind of talking in broad strokes here, that's not really what it looks like in practice. So I did want to spend just like a little bit of time talking about the classroom and the classroom practice, and keeping all of this in the balance. I kind of broke this down a little bit into some different categories that you might see and be able to speak to in your classroom. The first one being behavior management, which becomes...
Still figuring that out every day.
Yeah. It's interesting.
For all of my learners, I'm just, Well,
I didn't really know this until I got to know you better, talking about your career in your classroom. But behavior management is... an outsized portion of your day, at least with the way that you talk about your day when you come home from school. It's such a struggle sometimes, because not only do you have, maybe learners who have IEPs and 504s, but just like behavior management in general is also something that is
sometimes it's the
struggle.
Parole officer you're working with. It's all kinds of people. I know I've shared this quote before on here, but this goes along with behavior management as a whole, but it's like, I'm going to generalize it because I can't remember it verbatim, but the quote is basically like, students who are loved at home come to school to learn, and students who aren't loved at home come to school to be loved. And that's like, if I had to like define teaching, it would be that. I'm either loving them or I'm teaching them. And sometimes they're together, but usually they're separate. But it's that's behavior management in a nutshell.
So, and then we've got things that you might have touched also as like reading intensive work, if you want to talk a little bit about what that looks like sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, for me, obviously, as an English teacher, some of my students come in with like a physical accommodation, right? Which just means that maybe my student is in a wheelchair or whatever the case. So like that type of an IEP accommodation is very different, obviously. But for like students who have some other sort of disability, a cognitive or something, a learning disability, that's a little bit different, obviously. So like if my students have a reading and a writing goal, then that's part of the progress that I track for them for their IEP. That's part of the data set that we're always trying to keep up on. And then that's one of the biggest factors when we go into an IEP meeting, is to say, this is how their English language arts teacher says that they're doing on comprehension, writing, whatever. And a lot of those forms are basically asking me if this student is performing at what I would consider to be, in my case, a typical 10th grade student. So we try to, in my class at least, when I'm working with my kids who are identified for something, I'm always trying to make sure that I'm able to quantify in some way what I'm seeing, because I want to give good information to them and to their families and to whoever,
to help them
make sure that they're getting
decisions.
what they need.
Right.
So like the other thing that my school does, which is new this year, we have a new literacy course, and it's an intervention specialist who teaches it. And these students that are in it have been basically hand selected. I think almost all of them are identified with some kind of support service, but they're basically students that we've said, these kids are not performing where we would like to see them. So let's do like a general literacy course. And I think it's been really good for them. So, but that's pretty new. I mean, like I said, this is our first year with that. So I'm excited to see where that goes as well. But that's just one of the things that we made a change, and I think it's going to work. I think it's going to be good for our kids, and it just gets them reading more, which is a great way to improve any kind of literacy concerns. So, other things, we did a whole episode on this. Episode 44 is our assistive technology episode. That's a huge factor for this kind of work, obviously. Since I have been teaching, we've had a handful of students come through who had limited mobility concerns, things like that. So typing on a computer was always more helpful, or they might have a scribe or someone who reads to them, an aide, a one-on-one aide in some cases. So that assistive technology is huge for them because it allows them to participate just as their peers do. And it just looks a little bit different. And then one of the last kind of points is just inclusive forms of assessment and content standards as they go through it. And as I was thinking about this, Chelsea kind of had laid out the thoughts for me just to be considering. And I'm still learning about this. I'm still learning on assessments and content standards and how they work for my identified students, because up until last year, I didn't have a large population of identified students. But like I said, this is a lot of things. It's making sure your room is accessible. It's allowing for limited test options. It's writing different types of questions and tests, altering assignments, changing expectations to better reflect someone. I mean, I had a midterm today and I was looking at it and I was using an online learning website and I couldn't make the testing changes that I needed to make to fit this student's accommodations. So I printed it and I walked it over to their intervention specialist and I said, help me. I want them to take this test online because that's how they'll take my end of course exam. But I can't limit the options and I can't do these other things. So what do I do? And they help me, make sure that while staying true to the form of the test, that they still received what they needed. So I'm still learning. Like I said, I was at, my coworker's door early this morning with a printed out copy saying, please help. So it's a lot of things, and it's nothing you could say, this is exactly what I'm going to do. Because you just know it's going to be different.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter what I prepped. It's always something else.
So these intervention specialists that you're mentioning, just give us just a little bit more on their kind of day-to-day work.
I've worked with a couple different sets of intervention specialists at this point. I've worked with intervention specialists who do almost all co-teaching in a general education classroom and are just there to help support those identified students, but also help the content teacher as well, just to make sure that, in my case today, making sure a test is ready for whoever. In my school, it's a little bit different. Our intervention specialists have small groups that they pull out, and so they teach them content. All of our intervention specialists have a content that they focus in. Yeah,
I just want to make a quick note about that. There are entire courses in teacher education dedicated to whether or not pull-out classes are the best approach to this, because there's an argument to be made that pulling students out of their normal classroom flow is disruptive and also stigmatizing. And I think it can be that when it's done poorly, but also sometimes there are just ways that you can reach learners in smaller group settings that are more catered to their learning styles. So it's not an all or nothing answer, I don't think.
No, it's not.
But there definitely, I would say, even since we've been in our careers, the attitudes on this have shifted, because when we were in school, pull-out classes were kind of the norm for special education of all types. We had pull-out gifted classes, pull-out special ed classes, pull-out all of that stuff, which means that, these kids are in an isolated setting for the duration of whatever that course is or something. So anyway, there are just different approaches to that, and I think it's still, at least from my perspective, it remains to be seen when and how it's good and bad, I guess.
So when we were going through school, college, Chelsea and I were the same age, but when we were going through together, one of the big things that I was taught at my university in my education courses was LRE. Do you know what that is?
No.
Least restrictive environment. That's where you want every student learning, right? And the least restrictive environment. That isn't really used anymore as an acronym. It's probably some other acronym that means the exact same thing, but they've just put another bow on it, and it's fun to unwrap the same thing.
Stuff gets repackaged over and over again, but as we've observed many times.
That's essentially what you're talking about.
Yeah.
What is a student's least restrictive environment? And the other conversation that's important for this is that you're not only considering the environment for the student who's identified, you're also considering the learning environment of their peers.
Yeah.
And so sometimes decisions are made not because of 100% certainty it's the best interest for the identified student, but because it's the best interest of a class of students, which is a very hard line to walk. And I've been part of those conversations, and I've fought for and against kids too sometimes too, because I've seen it go both ways.
It can be especially difficult when there are really trying behavioral issues.
So I think what you're really boiling that down to, and I would agree with, is just what is a student's least restrictive environment? Where are they best suited? And what's best for everyone else who's also trying to learn? Because our small group classes are very, very small.
Aren't or are?
They are.
Gotcha.
We're talking like 5 and 6 kids. It's a very, very small population. So I think one thing that we do well at my school is trying to make sure that they're in as few of those as they reasonably can be. Obviously, there are all kinds of other classrooms that happen as part of like educational service centers with more intense disabilities, which that isn't always an option. But I think we do a good job of trying to make sure our IEP students are exactly where they belong.
Yeah,
whatever that looks like.
There's a social emotional impact of these decisions. However the decision goes, there's always a social emotional impact, like you're saying, both for the identified student and for everyone else who's at the school. Yeah. So.
And I've seen, especially my one good friend, really advocate for some students to say they might be struggling, but they belong in the classroom. And I've seen that same teacher then end up going into classrooms to be support for, a content teacher to make sure that that kid is getting the social environment, but also making sure that she's there to lend a hand when she needs to, which I think is really important, but it's very hard work. I cannot imagine being an intervention specialist who goes into somebody else's classroom and just is co-teaching it and trying their best to make sure that they're you know what I mean? Like, that would be hard work. So I give them a lot of credit for that. So my school does a little bit of everything. We do small group pull out. We do obviously whole group when possible to move them into, you know what I mean? Like the general population classroom. Or sometimes our intervention specialists go into classrooms and support directly with another teacher. So every single kid has its own, expectations and things like that. And we have students who are small group for maybe one content area, and the rest they're not. So I think that's good. I really do think we do our best to make sure that they're in the most appropriate place. So.
Okay, good. I had one more note here that I wanted to talk about, which is PBIS, which is the what does that stand for?
The reason why we're recording so late tonight is because I was in a positive behavioral intervention support team meeting.
Yes.
PBIS, as I call it.
So PBIS, this is from ODE's, the Ohio Department of Education's website. It's a framework that guides school teams in the selection, integration, and implementation of evidence-based practices for improving academic, social, and behavioral outcomes.
Look at all those words.
It's not a curriculum or a one-day training. It's a systems change process that requires ongoing commitment. So PBIS and your work in PBIS probably has some overlap with some of this special education focus. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
I think I've talked about PBIS before, but actually PBIS might be my favorite committee that I'm on, because what we get to do is
committee.
I know, how dare I? Did I ever
She
think
has a
I would
favorite
grow
committee.
up? I know, but I love it because I'm with teachers that I love and respect so much. And I think that's what really makes this committee, and especially at my school, in my experience, so amazing, is that I am working with people who love it just as much as I do. And that isn't the case with all your coworkers, as we all know. But PBIS, our goal is to help support students and recognize them in all kinds of ways for all kinds of things. We try to focus on celebrating kids that aren't often celebrated. So it's not the 4.0s and perfect attendance that we're just celebrating. It's also the kids that we see showing up and who have better attendance and who are passing, whatever the case. And I think it's just really valuable because a lot of our students, their successes look very different from like what most people think student success is. And that doesn't mean they don't deserve to be celebrated. It just means that perfect attendance isn't an option. It just means that they've got a sibling at home that sometimes they got to help with.
I always had an issue with attendance awards because
it's incredibly ableist, first of all.
It is. And much like the American workplace, it incentivizes coming in when you feel horrible from sickness, especially. That's the one thing where I'm just like, oh, so you're incentivized to come to school even if you feel like you're about to get sick.
Right.
Okay.
And I definitely think there's a line that we should value.
Sure.
Which is that
attending school is important, don't get me wrong.
It is, yes. But you don't want to come and get everybody else sick, which is my big thing. But we also have to know when to take care of ourselves. And what I like about PBIS, like I said, is that we work to find ways to celebrate kids who aren't in the paper for scoring the most points, who aren't going to get a full ride scholarship somewhere. And it's just because we recognize that there are tons of students we're celebrating that we want to build up, but they don't fall into another category where a school typically celebrates them. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really good work. I've been in PBIS for 3 years now. I'm still learning what we do. I'm still learning what that looks like for us. But I know that our group, I think we try really hard for the kids. And I think that what helps our group is that we, in my opinion, this is very humble of me to say, but we're the teachers who show up. And I think that's what matters. It's good work. It's hard work, but it's good work. And so anyways, PBIS helps support especially these types of learners because these are the kids we're targeting, right? A lot of kids who might be identified might not have a 4.0 GPA, so they might not be celebrated for honor roll or
the achievements that they do make that deserve to be celebrated. Yeah.
So that's our goal is just, we're trying to find reasons to recognize everybody. And sometimes it's that they came to school and we're no longer worried about sending a police officer to their home because they're no longer at desperate risk of being truant. And that's a reason to be excited today. And we're also the first group. We have a list of kids that we have a fear of when they turn 18 that they're going to drop out. And we keep track of those birthdays. And every time we see those kids after their 18th birthday, we make a point to be like, so glad you're here. So glad you're here. So glad you're here. And I think that type of work is super important because those are the kids who probably don't feel respected, encouraged, celebrated,
valued.
And so those are we have a list. We have a list of birthdays and we're always checking it to be like, who's about to turn 18 and who are we afraid of losing? And we find them. And sometimes we harass them so severely that the next day they don't show up and then we know it's our fault. But it's just because we're so excited, like we're like, yes, you're here. And you're 18 in a day. That's the best news ever. So 18 is that birthday is when you can unenroll yourself from school without any
legally an adult.
Yes. Yep. So 18th birthdays are very, very important for schools, and which is why we always want young students because we're afraid of 18th birthdays. Which is why we love when you start your kid a little bit early. Now, it has to be appropriate, don't get me wrong, but we love those seniors who don't turn 18 until like March and April. And because at that point, you made it this far. We can probably scoot you through, So anyways, that's some of the work we do for PBIS. So it's obviously not geared just to support identified learners or anything like that, but they're part of the group that we service. So.
Okay. All right.
Can I say one thing?
Yes, please.
Some of the most meaningful work I've gotten to do has been with students who have IEPs and 504s. And I just think it's just so much fun. I've made such special connections with these students who are sometimes viewed as other.
Yeah, I think just my general wrap up thoughts about this topic generally is that I think a lot of this work is done by some of the most unsung heroes of the school system. Yes. Their workloads tend to be much heavier than some of the rest of ours do because there are often a very limited number of intervention specialists and school psychologists and social workers and all these people who touch these IEPs and 504s those people are kind of few and far between in many school districts.
Yes, we could always use more.
It's
for sure.
definitely like an underserved community within education.
And those intervention specialists are like me as like as a content teacher, like a general content teacher. Like they are my saving grace. Like those are the people I go to first to make sure I'm not only to make sure I'm doing what I should be for the student, but also to get their help. Like these are some of the most well-rounded, most skilled teachers I know. Mm-hmm. So I just, I'm very thankful that we have the group that we do, and I feel lucky to learn from them and work with them. So, but it does push you out of your comfort zone, especially for someone like me. I did not have an IEP. I did not have a 504. So it was a big thing. There's a lot to learn at first because I wasn't, from a perspective of that. So it's good learning, but it's hard. So.
Yep. Okay. Are we ready to move on to fill in the blank?
I think so.
Okay.
Please don't write in and ask me like very nitty gritty details of 504s and IEPs because I did my best.
I think you did well. That's a good overview of those.
I was just trying to go basic because you were asking me questions last night and I was like, dang it.
I'm just curious about this stuff.
I was like texting the intervention specialist like.
Yeah.
Can you
a lot of questions.
Can you please help me with my homework for my podcast?
Podcast homework.
Okay. You want to do the last episode?
Yes, I would love to. Okay, so our last episode was about content creation for educational spaces, and here was the question. The first YouTube video was uploaded on April 23rd, 2005 at 8:31 a.m. and features a young man, Jawed Karim, standing in front of 2 elephants at the San Diego Zoo. The 19-second video was filmed by his friend Yakov Lipitsky and has since amassed more than 271 million views. What was the name of the first YouTube video? It was called Me at the Zoo.
I love that. It's so clear.
Me at the Zoo.
That's what we want.
I hope you had a good time at the zoo.
Me at the zoo.
Okay. And then what is this episode's question?
So this episode's question, write into us at hello@16to1.com if you know the answer. I'm going to finally, on my list for this weekend is to mail stickers to people because we owe people stickers. That's
we
on my
do
list.
owe a few stickers.
I'm sorry, Lindsay. I'm getting them too. I promise.
We got a bit behind on our sticker sends. But yes, if you know the answer, or even if you don't, write in, say hi. We'd love to hear from you. Hello@16to1.com.
Just make sure our email works. Sometimes it's just good to know it's still on.
Yeah, it's definitely still on. We get plenty of a lot of spam.
We do. Spam, I was just being dramatic.
But plenty of good conversations too. So just write in. We'd love to hear from you.
Okay, this episode's question.
Mm-hmm.
The 2023 Golden Globes recently recognized one of the year's most popular TV shows, which have been nominated for 5 awards and came home with 3 wins. They won Best Musical Comedy Series, Best TV Actor, and Best Supporting Actor. This show is set in Philly and follows the lives of a group of dedicated educators, and it was recently renewed for its 3rd season. What is that show?
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay. Are we ready to talk about what we learned?
Mm-hmm. You want me to go first or you want to go first?
Why don't you go ahead?
I kind of have stream of consciousness.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Well, recently I learned how fragile the U.S. government is. It is a fickle thing.
You only learned that recently.
No, but watching the Speaker of the House election,
yeah,
all of it.
We kind of turned into Parliament a little, or the House of Commons.
It did feel like the House of Commons.
It felt like we were watching British democracy happen instead of United States democracy happen. By that I mean there was a lot of bombastic gesturing and pomp and circumstance.
There was
huffety speeches and
huffety.
That's not really a word, but you know what I mean.
But it's exactly what it was.
Huffing and uppity, let's just say.
No, I like huffity.
Okay.
It is just a fragile, fickle thing. That's what I really learned.
Mm-hmm.
It is wild to me that without that one position, people can just behave that way. Like I am just shook.
Yeah,
by the actions because nobody can set any rules.
Yeah, we sort of shot ourselves in the foot because we created this system wherein the process has to work in a certain order.
Well,
so like nobody was sworn in. That was my thing. Is right. Like these people were not.
They're not getting paid.
They were not representatives yet because they couldn't be sworn in.
Yeah,
that was interesting.
So they could only do so much because they weren't all grown ups yet on the floor.
We're a real boy now.
On top of that, We had no third in command for a considerable period of time. And the kicker is that it took us that long to agree on the third in command, which is not great, let's just say. So, I watched that unfold for days. I think I learned a lot. I also think my brain just melted a little bit.
Uh-huh.
Okay. There's that.
Well, he also agreed to that recall rule. I think I read that. I'm pretty sure that he did. So basically, like, McCarthy now can be, if any one Republican, because it's probably going to be one of the rogue Republicans, gets mad with the speaker, they can put forward a motion to recall. I'm pretty sure that was part of the final deal. Okay. So basically, McCarthy is not only narrowly the speaker, but now he can be recalled with a very slim, like they're like 4 or 5 votes that have to swing the other way for him to be recalled, basically.
Yeah. Okay.
And all of the House Democrats might side with a recall vote in that case. So he's in an extremely precarious leadership position now, which is one of the things that was on the table. I guess we'll have to confirm whether or not that's really the case, but I'm pretty sure that that's actually part of the deal, wheeling and dealing that happened, is that they decided to allow the recall motion.
I have a question for you. Do they know what was in the deal?
Yeah, probably not to the full extent.
There's no way they could have kept track of it by then. I remember at one point on, like, I don't know, how many days was it? 4?
Something like that.
Or was it the end of the... Anyways, at one point I was like, we're doing one more speech to put the same guy's name up. Okay. Mm-hmm. That's kind of where I got. So anyways,
the nominating speeches.
Yes.
Yeah.
I learned...
Well, they have to be formally nominated. That's the other thing. It was a lot of, like, what I learned from all of that process was so much of the bureaucracy of how it all works, the process, and, like, you know, parliamentary procedure and all of these things. Yeah. I mean, I've always been a nerd about parliamentary procedure, but just the ways in which they have to function is kind of interesting.
Here's who I felt bad for. The people with the little golf pencils taking count.
The recorder. Yeah.
That's who I feel bad for.
The woman who had to record all the votes.
Of which our dollars are probably now fixing for their health insurance. Anyways, I learned that. I don't know what I learned, but I learned that.
Okay.
Other things, I read The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. Incredible book. I'm so late to the game. I'm listening to Concrete Rose by Angie Thomas right now. We are listening to Prince Harry's new book.
Yeah, I want to know what all the
drama. Topic.
I want to know what all the drama's about. I just want to be culturally informed about, like, the trashiest segments of pop culture and its intersection.
I don't think it's trashy.
No. I mean the conversation around it is trashy.
I love that part.
The trashy conversations around the intersection of pop culture and the royal family is it's amusing, at least, for sure.
Well, I'll go on the record and say that I'm team Harry and Meghan. Okay. So that's a hot take right there.
Hot take.
The last thing, I don't even know why I'm talking about it, because I think I
wait until you finish the book to say you're on Team Harry.
Okay,
because maybe you'll change teams.
Hesitantly leaning towards, but we'll update on the next episode.
People have been pretty critical of his discussions of his involvement in the military, and I'm looking forward to that part of his story as well, because I read a pretty harsh takedown of his kind of inability to take responsibility for some of the atrocities of the war that he was involved with. But again,
You're kind of yucking my yum right now.
No, I'm sorry.
I just want you to know.
Well, I'm just interested in it. I'm interested to see.
I'm only like an hour in, so I haven't really gotten to, like, war crimes yet.
Yeah. You haven't reached the war crimes chapter yet.
No, he's like, his mom just died. Like, it's still very young.
Yeah. Yep.
Well, I'm probably going to hate it, but that's what I am listening to. No. And the last thing I think I did hate was we watched, finally, the Kristen Bell show, which is not new, but it's called The Woman in the House Across the Street from the Girl in the Window.
That's quite a title.
I love Kristen Bell. I don't think I loved the show.
The show was pretty weird. And it ends on a weird cliffhanger.
Anyways, that's all I have, I think.
Okay.
I've decided I'm going to teach King Lear this year. That's the other thing.
That's exciting.
I'm nowhere near prepared for it, but I will be.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what matters. That's everything.
Okay.
Please turn off my microphone.
No, not yet. Not just
the other
yet.
night, I told Chelsea I think I said, leave me alone. And you looked at me and you said, oh, you said the thing you thought. That's how I feel right now. Please turn off my microphone.
I said, you said the thing you actually meant.
I wasn't sugarcoating.
Leave me alone.
Okay. I also just want to mention, for the sake of history, that we're recording this in the dead of midterms, days before grades are due. So please remember that if I do not age properly with my hot takes, I am under great stress and I have no spoons. Okay.
We'll give you some leeway. For sure.
I wanted to say it. This is basically like me being like, allegedly. Okay.
Allegedly. So, everything I said, alleged. Okay.
What did you learn? You learned some nerdy stuff.
Oh, the nerdiest of stuff. So, Dungeons and Dragons. I've talked about it before on the podcast. One of my favorite pastimes. And we have a large friend group in Maryland who regularly plays D&D. And what I learned is that there's hot drama in the D&D world this week because...
What a time to be alive.
Wizards of the Coast. They are the company that owns Magic the Gathering IP, among other things. If you're a fellow nerd, you probably have heard of that card game. But they also own Dungeons and Dragons as part of their intellectual property. They were acquired by Hasbro at some point. I'm not sure when.
The whole kit and caboodle.
Yeah, they're a subsidiary of Hasbro, basically, as I understand it. And so as can happen when you're when a business is acquired by a large corporate entity, the large corporate entity is like, how can we squeeze more dollars out of this business we have acquired? And Hasbro apparently decided that the D&D brand was under-monetized, which is a disgusting word, but it might be true.
Cannot imagine it being under-monetized.
Well, so here's the thing. The thing that happened that I learned about was that Wizards of the Coast, there was a leak of a new version of the Open Gaming License, which was this license that the 1.0 version has been around for 20 years or something like that allowed third-party content creators to interact with and build on top of certain kind of mechanics and lore and systems within the D&D gaming world. It allowed these third-party content creators to create content around D&D that wasn't necessarily D&D itself, but was relied on stuff in the D&D canon.
Can you give an example of something like this?
For
people like me.
There are entire systems of games. So Pathfinder is a really big one that you probably haven't heard of, but it doesn't matter. But it's just a whole other company took the D&D IP and built, campaigns and storylines and
the books?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Well, I mean, a lot of it's books. It ends up being books, but just materials.
I'm probably sitting beside 8 of them. Right
well, character types and stuff like that. Yeah. So all these things that can interface with the general systems of the nerdiest game ever. So those third-party content creators were, in many people's eyes in the gaming community, responsible for the resurgence of interest in Dungeons and Dragons. So D&D is now kind of
Stranger Things.
Yeah, Stranger Things too. D&D is now kind of back in pop culture in a way that it hasn't been in a while, and a lot of people attribute that to the work of these third-party creators. So anyway, Wizards of the Coast, this last week sometime, a revised Open Gaming License 1.1 or whatever was leaked, and people are rather upset about it because it retroactively negates the original Open Gaming License, or attempts to. Whether or not that has legal standing remains to be seen. There are a bunch of class action lawsuit whisperings now happening because of all of this, but
yikes.
It retroactively says, that one's not is void now, and moving forward we have this new Open Gaming License which requires this kind of stringent royalty structure. But the thing about it that's most onerous to me is that it requires anybody who creates third-party content to report revenue from that content to Wizards of the Coast, and it allows Wizards of the Coast to take that content that third-party creators have used and sell it as their own with no royalties back to the original content creators. I don't like
this.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. So anyway, that's the gist of the leaked text, and people are very much up in arms about it, and Wizards of the Coast has canceled press conferences about it twice at least this week, and
because they're trying to scramble to figure out.
There's a huge backlash, and then a lot of these other companies and creators are saying to heck with that. We're going to just completely reformulate our own systems so that we don't have to adhere to this new license if you go through this license. Yeah. So they've essentially shot themselves in the foot, destroyed all goodwill with the D&D community, and who knows what will happen going forward. But I thought that was a very interesting legal quandary that they find themselves in.
What was the recent company that something that they were about to do got leaked and it faced such intense backlash that they canceled it before it ever happened? Do you remember that?
That seems like a lot.
It just happened.
I don't know.
Like in the past year. Oh, Cricket.
Oh,
remember?
Cricket.
Yeah.
It was the
Cricket
design software.
They were going to change it and it got like, I don't know if it got leaked or not, but it got published what they were going to do. And then everyone was like, no.
Yes.
Then they got rid of it.
So the company that makes Crickets, those little like cutting machines that help, we can do like custom vinyl cuts and stuff. We have a Cricket. We bought the Cricket before this proposed change. They were basically going to start charging people to use their devices off in an offline fashion, more or less. Is kind of how it came down. But yeah, so you were going to be charged to use the product that you already bought and could use in a certain way before, and then they were going to change it.
And then no longer could.
Yeah, they, like, I think within a day or two, reversed entirely.
So maybe that's what will happen here.
Yeah, I kind of don't think so, because Hasbro is a pretty evil overlord corporate entity.
I was trying to be hopeful.
In the game world. But we shall see. There might be such backlash and pressure, and investors hear that kind of stuff and stuff gets scary. But I mean, Hasbro's been downgraded. Like, they got double downgraded. Like, their stock got double downgraded a while back. So like, they're in a not good spot anyway. And I totally understand wanting to maintain control of your own IP, but doing it in this way that destroys all of this goodwill that they've built is pretty shady and underhanded. And I'm just sad about what's going to happen to the future of the game that so many people love, because the IP is entrusted to these goons. But
it's a great game.
Yeah, it's a really fun game.
Yeah.
You yourself are an expert druid.
I don't know if expert.
Kate has a level 20 druid.
Yeah.
Save the world.
I do. He's a hero.
We save the world.
Gosh, that's fun.
Yeah. Anyway, that's what I learned. That was a long-winded what I learned, but
that makes me want to play D&D.
Yeah, I want to play D&D all the time. Okay. Any final thoughts? Wrap ups?
No, just hope for snow. I don't know.
We do love some snow.
I could use a snow day. No, I just we've been working on our Lego sets. But no, we've just been kind of chilling. I kind of enjoy this time of year. I say that hesitantly because it's midterms, but
it's a little bit slower pace than usual, and that can be kind of a slog in one way, but it gives us more time to kind of just relax and collect ourselves, and
for sure
have a little bit of time, except for midterms.
Other than that,
than midterms.
Anyways,
okay,
all right. Take care of yourselves.
Thanks for joining us.
We will see you in 2 weeks.
Talk to you in 2 weeks. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for supporting 16 to 1.
We're trying to grow our audience, so please check us out at 16to1.com, all spelled out, and tell your friends about the show.
On our website, you can find links to follow us on social media, an archive of all our old episodes, and a contact form where you can get in touch.
Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you next show. I hope the camera, or the video, the video. God knows what I do.
Are you good?
Can they see me on a podcast?
Can they what? Can they see you?
That was basically what I just went through.
In their mind's eye. Yes.